Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Today's program is a departure from our usual interview format. Sometimes an article comes across my desk that explains current events in a way that is so clear and accurate that I want to share it with a wider audience. In this case, it's from a source that's widely respected throughout the Middle East, but is rarely heard in the United States. That source is Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of the Lebanese political party Hezbollah. Every time the word Hezbollah is mentioned in the U.S. press, it is preceded or followed by the word terrorist, because the Party of God is on the U.S. State Department's terrorist list. But that's a political judgment, not a descriptive term. Hezbollah does have a significant paramilitary arm. It was founded in the early 1980s to fight against the Israeli invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon. In the early 1990s, however, Hezbollah transformed itself into a political party and is now one of the most important political parties in the coalition that governs Lebanon. The speech by Hassan Nasrallah was made on May 2nd in commemoration of the death of a Hezbollah commander in Syria 3 years ago. I will quote extensively from an English translation of his speech, and he began by talking about the validity of the decision by Hezbollah to participate in the war in Syria in support of the Syrian government. Day after day, our confidence and certainty is reinforced. What we did was 100% just and absolutely right, and we went to the right place at the right time. Every day it becomes clearer that what happened in Syria was very different from what happened in the rest of the Arab world during the Arab Spring. In Syria, there was a U.S.-Israeli-Saudi plot for which some countries from the Gulf and the region were used. The Syrian issue had nothing to do with elections, democracy, reforms, change, or with any of this nonsense we have heard since 2011. And the proof is that the United States, Saudi Arabia, and those countries who participated in the plot, who did they come up with and push forward for their supposed humanitarian democratic change in Syria? This formula should be put in inverted commas highlighted with 2 red lines and, as the Syrians say, followed up with 1,000 question marks and 1,000,000 exclamation marks. Who did they come up with in this alleged purpose? Democratic forces, forces from the popular will, forces whose culture and ideology tends to shape a better future? Where have you seen any such thing? In order not to talk in theoretical and blurry terms and invoke merely documents or theoretical evidence, let us talk about an obvious, visible, and undeniable reality, namely Daesh. Let us consider the example of Daesh. As you may know, Daesh is the Arabic acronym for what is usually referred to in the West as the Islamic State or ISIS. The word Daesh is nonsensical in Arabic and is insulting to the group, whereas the terms usually used in the West promote the idea that the terror group represents Islam in some way. Nasrallah asked a number of questions about Daesh that Western media often fail to ask. And again, I quote, "Where did they come from? Who brought them here? Who armed them? Who eased things up for them and gave them all the opportunities? Who gave them money? Who opened all the borders for them? Who covered them favorably in the media? All the Arab satellite channels constantly repeated with praise, 'the Islamic State.' Who did all that? We must never forget. Neither the Lebanese who have pushed back Daesh have the right to forget, nor the Syrian people, nor the Iraqi people, nor all of the peoples of the region must ever forget all the atrocities perpetrated by Daesh, the Western and regional countries and the media that supported them, and everything that Daesh will continue to do, as I'll mention later." And what is Daesh? What is its ideology? It is the Wahhabi ideology that is shaped in Saudi Arabia, in the Saudi universities, in the Saudi religious schools, in Saudi mosques, that was propagated around the world with Saudi money, originally to thwart Khomeini's revolutionary Islam. By decision and at the request of the United States, as recognized by both the Americans and the Saudis. Before the confession of Mohammed bin Salman about this fact, there was a video recording of Hillary Clinton where she acknowledged this, namely that it is the U.S. who asked Saudi Arabia to support, propagate, and disseminate the Wahhabi ideology worldwide.
We also have a history of kind of moving in and out of Pakistan. I mean, let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago. And we did it because we were locked in this struggle with the Soviet Union. They invaded Afghanistan, and we did not want to see them control Central Asia. And we went to work. And it was President Reagan in partnership with the Congress, led by Democrats, who said, you know what, sounds like a pretty good idea. Let's deal with the ISI and the Pakistani military, and let's go recruit these mujahideen. And let's get some to come from Saudi Arabia and other places, importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam so that we can go beat the Soviet Union. And guess what? They retreated. They lost billions of dollars, and it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's a very strong argument, which wasn't a bad investment to end the Soviet Union, but let's be careful what we sow because we will harvest. So we then left Pakistan. We said, okay, fine. You deal with the stingers that we've left all over your country. You deal with the mines that are along the border. And by the way, we don't want to have anything to do with you. In fact, we're sanctioning you. So we stopped dealing with the Pakistani military and with ISI, and we now are making up for a lot of lost time.
As Nasrallah pointed out, Daesh derives its ideology from the Wahhabi ideology that is shaped in Saudi Arabia, in Saudi universities, in the Saudi religious schools and mosques, and that was propagated around the world with Saudi money by a decision and at the request of the United States, as recognized by both the Americans and the Saudis. Here's an excerpt from a Press TV documentary aired in 2017 about Wahhabism.
When it comes to what is falsely labeled as Islamist terrorism in Western mainstream media, certainly without fail, all terrorists in the bulk of terrorist attacks these past 15 years acknowledge Wahhabi motivations for their actions. Surprisingly, for many in the West, Takfiri terrorism has killed more Muslims than members of other religions. In other words, Takfiri terrorism has practically waged war against Muslims.
Wahhabism can exist in religion without necessarily a name. Wahhabism is almost a natural aspect of the dark side, one can say, of religion, which is intolerance of any other belief system apart from your own. It's because of the use of Saudi petrodollars to spread this virulent ideology throughout the Muslim world. We find that a large majority of Sunni mosques are actually funded and used by Wahhabis to promote their teachings. And this is especially true in Western countries like the United Kingdom, like the USA, Canada, and so forth.
I want to explain the term Takfiri, which was used in that clip and is often used by Middle Eastern sources to describe the terrorist ideology. A Takfiri is a Muslim who accuses another Muslim of being an unbeliever because he does not follow the belief system of the Takfiri. A Muslim apostate, according to this ideology, should be punished by death. It's clear, even from the mouth of President Trump, that the Saudi family rules Arabia because it receives support from the U.S. and the West, and that same Saudi family is the prime protector and funder of Wahhabism. Here's Nasrallah again. Where does this ISIS ideology come from? Saudi Arabia? At the request of whom? The United States. Who facilitated this? The Americans and their allies. Who funded it? Saudi Arabia. And the ISIS fighters, where did they come from? They were brought from all over the world. Oh, my brothers and sisters, most of the suicide bombers in Syria and Iraq were Saudi nationals. And there were other nationalities as well, and they were brought to these cities. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia are the ones who supported them, armed them, financed them, have opened all the borders for them, and have staked so much on them. Daesh was initially required only against Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, and later against Iran and against whoever was to be submitted, hit, and destroyed. What is the Daesh project? To establish a state in which there will be elections, a democratic state, a state in which the people can express their will, a state whose inhabitants will elect their members of parliament, their leaders and rulers? Never. For Daesh, according to the ideology of Daesh, elections are an act of disbelief deserving of death. Anyone who participates in elections is a disbeliever in their eyes. Whoever stands near a ballot box, his blood shall be shed. He is to be killed. Is it not what Al-Qaeda and the Taliban did in Afghanistan? Is it not what happened in Iraq during all the elections that were held? Is Daesh able to shape a better future? And by whom were these monsters created? By the United States. In the past, an individual named, anyone can find this video over the internet, I speak of General Wesley Clark, and it was on CNN, my brother. I don't quote a TV channel of our friends or allies, who was the supreme commander of NATO forces. Wesley Clark said on CNN that the Islamic State, they do not speak of Daesh, they keep saying the Islamic State.
ISIS got started through funding from our friends and allies, because as people will tell you in the region, if you want somebody who will fight to the death against Hezbollah, you don't put out a recruiting poster and say, you know, sign up for us, we're going to make a better world. You go after zealots and you go after these religious fundamentalists. That's who fights Hezbollah.
Daesh was meant to fight the resistance axis, all these forces facing the US and the Israeli project. Syria rejected surrender and submission to the US, and that's why it had to be destroyed. There are people who have never done anything against Israel, but who spend their time denigrating Syria, saying that for decades there has been no resistance in the Golan. It is enough for the honor of Syria and its current and former leaders to have never surrendered, to have remained steadfast against Israel, to have held on and protected the Lebanese and Palestinian resistance, not to have submitted to U.S. dictates when the whole world was subject to them, with the exception of Iran and some popular forces, including Hezbollah. What was required was to break up Syria in the interests of the United States and Israel. That was Hassan Nasrallah, Secretary General of Hezbollah, speaking on May 2nd. Listen to Julian Assange speaking to UK's Channel 4 in September of 2015.
American destabilization, together with the destabilization provided by Europe in Syria and in Libya, together with the destabilization provided by US allies, Saudi, Qatar, and Turkey, is what has created the Islamic State, and it is what continues to propel the Islamic State. The failure of the press here to properly cover what has been happening in Syria has led to the rise of the Islamic State. That's a very, very, very serious phenomenon that the intelligence agencies have run amok, that military suppliers have run amok, that Saudi, Qatar, and Turkey have run amok, and as a result, we now have a situation where we have the Islamic State. We wouldn't have an Islamic State if we had proper understanding of how foreign policy works in practice.
That may be true.
How it works in practice is it doesn't suit the interests, not even of the people of Syria. It doesn't even suit the interests of the West, because you have particular crazed factions in the West, various intelligence agencies, always looking to justify their budgets, always looking for a boy's own adventure, and as a result, we have the calamity that is the Islamic State.
Last question.
Nasrallah went on to discuss the recent bombings in Sri Lanka, saying, "Has someone asked about the ideology that perpetrated the suicide operations and atrocious massacres in Sri Lanka against innocent men, women, and children in churches and hotels? Where does it come from? Who stands behind this ideology? Who supports it, finances it, revives it, defends it? Is it not the kingdom of Saudi Arabia? Why do you condemn only the instruments and say nothing about the true and essential reason for this terrorism, namely Wahhabism? Daesh is still a security risk, and we must all behave as facing a permanent threat. We must face it politically, culturally, in the media, militarily, in terms of security, and on every field. Furthermore, this threat will never be far from Lebanon. It is true that the army and the resistance embraced by the people and through a national consensus liberated our land from Daesh and its ilk, but this danger is not far from us and it is not finished. It is true that we have achieved great victories on all fronts in the fight against Daesh and its ilk and against the whole U.S., Israeli, Saudi project in the region, but we must consider that the danger persists and act accordingly to remedy it. And on this issue, we must not forget the identity of those responsible, because it's one of the challenges today. The main culprits are the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. What Daesh perpetrated against the peoples of our region, against Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, what it still perpetrates in Yemen and Nigeria, what it has perpetrated in Sri Lanka, all these horrible crimes, this massive destruction, those billions of economic losses, hundreds of thousands of martyrs and wounded, dishonor inflicted on women raped and subjected to slavery, and the Christian and Muslim holy places desecrated and destroyed. All these losses, shall we forget them? Everything that happens in our region is at the service of Israel, its influence and hegemony, in order to complete Trump's deal of the century, which is designed to liquidate the Palestinian cause, and at the service of the United States politically and financially. Who can say otherwise? Someone dare tell us otherwise and defend Saudi Arabia, claim that it acts in the interests of the Arab community. This insistence on waging wars and financing of wars, in whose interest is it? Whose interest, indeed? You're listening to Wider View, and we're focusing today on a speech delivered on May 2nd by Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of the Lebanese political party Hezbollah. While you may not agree with much of what Nasrallah says, he is one of the most revered leaders in the Islamic world, and his words reflect an understanding of U.S. Saudi-backed terrorism that many in that region share. Apparently, some of Nasrallah's followers send him interesting videos of U.S. officials. And one that caught his attention recently was this interview of U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. As Nasrallah pointed out, the U.S. Secretary of State is a diplomat who must inspire confidence, political trust, diplomatic distrust, because he has to manage global affairs, to ensure peace in the world, and give people their rights and so forth. Here's Pompeo being asked about the slogan of West Point, where he studied.
In terms of how you think about problem sets, when I was a cadet, what's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment.
Nasrallah couldn't resist commenting on this. Imagine then that the leading U.S. diplomat confesses to be a liar, a cheater, and a thief. It's not me who described him. He described himself in these words, this man who was in Lebanon just a few days ago and who came to tour the world. By mentioning all this, I want to come to this conclusion. Whoever trusts and pins his hopes in the United States to settle our problems and concerns for us and help our causes, may God help us if they were to be the intermediary to solve the problem of our land and maritime borders with occupied Palestine. They want to impose their terms. They want to impose themselves in Lebanon in the interests of Israel. The United States does not negotiate. They just impose their conditions and give ultimatums. Such are Trump and Pompeo. Liars, cheaters, thieves. They support and favor Israel at the expense of the whole world, not only at the expense of Arabs, Muslims, and Christians of the region, but at the expense of the whole world. Regarding the bloody and monstrous Saudi-American alliance, we must be clear and firm. As you can see, Hassan Nasrallah has some insights into U.S. foreign policy that we often do not hear. Danny Haifong, last week's guest, says in American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, his new book, and I quote, American exceptionalism defines the enemy as anyone or anything that is presumed to hate the American way of life, and those who hate the American way of life have no rights that the American nation-state is bound to respect. American exceptionalism has always presumed national innocence despite imposing centuries of war and plunder. The United States has been at war for over 90% of its existence. All these wars have been justified as necessary ventures meant to defend or expand America's so-called founding values and beliefs. A consequence of centuries of endless war has been the historical tendency of the United States to erase from consciousness the realities that surround American and domestic and international policy, not to mention the system of imperialism that governs both. The declaration of a war on terror was and remains a defining moment for the legacy of American exceptionalism. It utilized a period of crisis to cement the image that the U.S. and its representative values were in perpetual danger. The threat to American national security lay in the rise of Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism. As practitioners of jihad or holy war, these demonized others from foreign lands served as a scapegoat for the war on terror imperial policy. And for the first time, American exceptionalism was promoted not just as a service to humanity, but rather a convenient excuse to expand American power at the expense of people and the planet on every coast. This program will first air on May 14th, and that's an important date. Author and activist Miko Peled tells us why. In a recent article on Mint Press News, Peled says, quote, "A custom that can only be described as insensitive, if not outright cruel, and which has been in place since Palestine was destroyed, is the celebration of Israeli independence. Just as Israeli elections were held on the day that Palestinians commemorate the massacre at Deir Yassin, Israel callously celebrates a day of independence at the same time as Palestinians mourn the loss of their country. The apartheid regime we know as Israel was built on the very ruins of Palestine and imposed a brutal regime on those who still live in their country. Millions of Palestinians still languish in refugee camps in and around Palestine, yet Israel and its allies around the world celebrate. Israelis are not the indigenous people of Palestine. What we know today as Israelis are people who came to colonize, mostly during the time of the British Mandate in Palestine. And they did so largely with the assistance of the British government. The British Mandate over Palestine, which was in reality an occupation of the country, facilitated the creation of the Zionist apartheid regime in Palestine. The Jews who came to colonize and settle in Palestine were never oppressed or occupied. In fact, they were privileged. The Jewish settlements in Palestine had services like running water and electricity long before many of the Palestinian communities did, and they were assisted by the British in every possible way." End quote. And that was Miko Peled. The excellent website elnakbahistory.com tells the story of the three Zionist terror groups who, quote, systematically planned and executed the expulsion of the Palestinians who owned over 93% of Palestine in 1947. This ethnic cleansing operation had been prepared over the preceding year, ready for implementation when perceived necessary, to drive out the indigenous Arab population and seize their land and properties once the British administrative authority was gone. Zionist preparations documented by Israeli historian Ilan Pappé in his book The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine included financial support from the U.S. Jewish community circumventing government prohibitions, weapons smuggling, and the infiltration of Arab communities to identify leaders for quick assassination. These terrorist militias had ethnically cleansed a third of the Palestinian population before the British departed in May 1948, and by the end of 1948 had driven over 750,000 Palestinians into 59 refugee camps hastily constructed to accommodate them. By the end of the ethnic cleansing campaign, the Zionists had destroyed and/or depopulated 531 Arab villages in 11 urban areas and had committed 33 documented massacres that killed some 13,000 largely defenseless Arabs. This was an intentional terrorist strategy. Reports of each massacre terrified other Arab villages into fleeing their homes and communities in the path of approaching Jewish forces. By 1950, nearly 1 million Palestinian refugees had been registered by the United Nations in refugee camps with land claims against Israel. With their descendants who are legal heirs to the stolen property, that number now exceeds 4.5 million, the largest and longest-standing refugee population in the world." End quote. And that was from the website allnakbahistory.com. For those Palestinians still living within historic Palestine, the ethnic cleansing continues. Former Wider View guest Alison Weir reports this week that Israeli forces have killed approximately 290 Gazans and have injured over 29,000 since the Gazans began their weekly Great March of Return on March 30th, 2018. Among those killed and maimed have been numerous medics, women, children, and journalists. Approximately 126 Gazans have had legs and/or arms amputated, and others have been permanently paralyzed. While the Israeli governmental statements, often parroted by U.S. media, claims that Israel targets terror, the large majority of Gazans killed by Israeli forces have been civilians. End quote. That from Alison Weir. And that's all we have time for in this episode of Wider View. The views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of the radio station to which you're listening. Our aim is to provoke you to think outside the box and question the narratives you hear from the mainstream media and our national leaders. I hope we've succeeded. Your comments and questions are welcome. Please direct them to widerviewradio@gmail.com. You can find links to the articles mentioned on this program at our website, widerviewradio.podbean.com. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.